My name is Sarah, and I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. It's a cozy place, surrounded by tall trees that sway gently in the wind. I've always loved the tranquility, but lately, something strange has been happening. At first, it was just little things. Food disappearing from the kitchen, or the kitchen window left open when I was certain I'd closed it. I thought I was just being forgetful. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint noise above me. It sounded like footsteps, light and hesitant, moving across the attic floor. My heart pounded as I tried to reassure myself that it was just the house creaking or maybe a raccoon. But the next morning, I found more evidence. An empty can of beans on the kitchen counter that I hadn't opened, crumbs scattered on the floor, and the attic door slightly ajar. Summoning all my courage, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the attic stairs. The air was musty, and dust floated in the beam of light. When I reached the top, I saw a small bed made of old blankets and a few empty cans of food. Someone had been living there. I felt a wave of fear mixed with curiosity. Who could be staying here and why my house? That night, I stayed up, waiting and listening. Around midnight, I heard the noise again. I tiptoed down to the kitchen and waited in the dark. Moments later, a figure emerged from the attic. It was a thin man, dressed in ragged clothes, with exhaustion written on his face. He froze when he saw me. "Please don't call the police," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I have nowhere else to go." I could see the fear and desperation in his eyes. Instead of feeling scared, I felt a strange sense of empathy. "I'm not going to call the police," I replied, "but you have to tell me why you're here." His name was Jack. He had lost his job and home months ago and had been wandering the streets ever since. He had discovered my attic on a cold night and had been sneaking in for food and shelter. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't let him keep living there, but I also couldn't bring myself to turn him away. I decided to help him. I offered him a warm meal, and as we sat at the kitchen table, we talked. Jack shared stories about his life, his dreams, and how everything had fallen apart. For the first time in a long while, I felt a connection to someone. The next day, I took Jack to a local shelter and helped him connect with social services. We worked on his resume together, and I reached out to friends who might have job leads. Jack was incredibly grateful, and I saw hope begin to flicker in his eyes. Days turned into weeks, and Jack and I developed a routine. He would come over for meals, and we'd work on job applications and practice interview skills. Slowly, he began to regain his confidence. One evening, after he had returned to the shelter, I realized how much my life had changed since he came into it. I no longer felt lonely. Jack had become a dear friend. One day, Jack came over with fantastic news. He had landed a job at a local store. We celebrated with a homemade dinner, and I could see the pride shining in his eyes. He thanked me for believing in him when no one else did. I told him he deserved it, and I was so proud of him. With his new job, Jack found a small apartment and moved out of the shelter. We didn't see each other as often since he was busier, but we stayed in touch, having dinner once a week and catching up on life. As time went by, Jack continued to thrive. He got promoted, made new friends, and even began volunteering at the shelter he had once stayed in. Watching him grow and succeed brought me so much joy. One evening, Jack invited me over to his new place for dinner. When I walked in, I saw a framed photo of the two of us from one of our dinners. He smiled and said, "Sarah, you changed my life. I don't know where I'd be without you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I hugged him. "You changed mine too, Jack," I replied. "You reminded me of the power of kindness and how important it is to help each other." From that day on, Jack and I remained close friends. Our bond, born from a frightening and uncertain situation, had blossomed into something beautiful. I learned that sometimes, the scariest moments can lead to the most heartwarming outcomes, and that kindness and generosity can truly transform lives. Now, my little house on the edge of town no longer feels empty. It's filled with memories of a friendship that began in the most unexpected way. Every time I hear the gentle creak of the attic, I smile, remembering how it all started. I took the night shift job as a security guard because I needed the money. It wasn't my first choice, but the pay was decent, and I figured it would be easy work. My name is John, and this is the story of the scariest night of my life. The building where I worked was old and massive. It used to be a factory, but now it was abandoned. My job was to walk around the building, making sure everything was secure. Every hour, I had to check every room and note that nothing was out of the ordinary. I started my shift at 10 p.m. and finished at 6 a.m. The first few nights were peaceful. I brought a book to read and drank coffee to stay awake. I enjoyed the quiet. It gave me time to think. But on the fourth night, things changed. At first, everything seemed normal, just like any other night. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. and took over from Bill, the day shift guard. Bill was an old man who had been working there for years. He warned me about the noises. "This building is old," he said. "It creaks and makes strange sounds. Don't let it scare you." I laughed, telling him I wasn't afraid of a few noises. At 10 p.m., I began my first round. The building was dark, and the beam from my flashlight cast long shadows on the walls. I walked through each room, checking the doors and windows. Everything was fine. At 11 p.m., I started my second round. This time, I heard something. It was a soft whisper. I stopped and listened. The whispering stopped too. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just the wind. At midnight, I was in the basement. The basement was the creepiest part of the building. It was cold, damp, and smelled of mold. I was about to leave when I heard the whispering again. This time, it was louder, coming from the dark corner of the room. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice echoed through the empty space. No one answered. I shined my flashlight into the corner, but there was nothing there. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly finished my check and hurried upstairs. At 1 a.m., I was back in the main hall. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just my imagination. I tried to focus on my job, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. At 2 a.m., I decided to take a break. I went to the security office and sat down. The office was small, with a desk, a chair, and a few monitors showing different parts of the building. I stared at the screens, hoping to see something that would explain the noises, but everything looked normal. 3 a.m., I had to do another round. Even though I was scared, I forced myself to go. As I walked through the empty rooms, it felt like the shadows were closing in on me. The whispering started again, louder and clearer. It sounded like a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and spun around. Again, there was nothing there. I hurried through the rest of my check and went back to the office. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I needed the job. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just an old building making noises. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. At 4 a.m., I saw something on the monitor. In one of the rooms, there was a figure. It was tall and dark, standing still. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the room. When I got there, it was empty. I searched the entire room, but there was no sign of anyone. I went back to the office, my hands trembling. I couldn't explain what I had seen. I felt like I was losing my mind. I checked the monitors again, but the figure was gone. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but I knew it wasn't. By 5 a.m., I was exhausted. I just wanted the night to be over. I decided to do one last round. As I walked through the building, the feeling of being watched never left me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. I reached the basement again. The whispering was louder than ever, echoing from every corner. I felt a hand on my shoulder and whipped around. No one was there. I ran out of the basement and didn't stop until I was back in the office. At 6 a.m., Bill arrived to take over. He took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I told him everything. He nodded and said, "You're not the first. This place is haunted. They say a worker died here years ago, and his spirit never left. That morning I quit. I couldn't handle another night in that building. The memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, I hear the whispering in my dreams and wake up drenched in cold sweat. I'll never forget my time as a night shift security guard. I never liked working late. The silence of the empty office always made me feel uneasy, but I didn't have a choice. The deadline was coming up, and I still had so much to do. The office, which was usually buzzing with the sound of ringing phones and people talking, now felt eerily quiet. All I could hear was the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional creak of the building settling. My name is Tom, and I work as a graphic designer. It was a Friday night, and the office was completely empty. Everyone had left hours ago, excited to start their weekend. I watched my last coworker leave, secretly wishing I could be carefree like them. I took a deep breath and turned back to my computer screen, determined to finish my work. Outside the window, the daylight gradually faded until darkness swallowed everything. The only light in the room came from my computer monitor and the small desk lamp beside me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was just my imagination, I thought. I never liked working late. Around midnight, I decided to take a break. I stood up and stretched, my muscles aching from sitting for so long. I walked to the break room to make a cup of coffee. The hallway was pitch dark, and my footsteps echoed against the tiled floor. I flicked the switch, and the fluorescent lights flickered on, casting a harsh, cold glow. I poured myself some coffee and leaned against the counter, sipping slowly. The warmth of the coffee made me feel a little better. As I stood there, I thought I heard a noise. It was faint, almost like a whisper. I stopped, trying to listen, but there was nothing, just the hum of the vending machine and the distant sounds of the city. I shook my head and chuckled nervously. "You're just imagining things, Tom," I muttered to myself. Finishing my coffee, I returned to my desk. Walking down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. When I reached my desk, I noticed something odd. My computer screen had gone black. I jiggled the mouse, but nothing happened. I frowned and tried to turn it back on, but it was dead. Frustrated, I checked the power cable and realized it had been unplugged. A chill ran down my back. I knew I hadn't unplugged it. My hands shook as I plugged the cable back in and powered up the computer. The screen flickered to life, and I let out a sigh of relief. But that relief didn't last long. A message appeared on the screen. "Get out." I stared at the words, my heart thudding in my chest. It had to be a prank. Someone was messing with me. But who? Everyone had left hours ago. I looked around the empty office, half expecting to see someone hiding, but there was no one. I decided to ignore the message and get back to work. Maybe I was just tired and seeing things. I opened my project file and tried to concentrate, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. Time dragged on, and I forced myself to keep working, but the uneasiness was relentless. I kept glancing at the clock, wishing for the night to end. Suddenly, I heard the noise again. This time it was louder. It sounded like footsteps coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. The noise stopped. Taking a deep breath, I cautiously walked toward the hallway. It was empty just like before. I decided to check the office one more time just to be sure. I walked past empty desks and cubicles, my eyes scanning every shadow. At the far end of the office, I noticed something strange. The door to one of the small conference rooms was slightly ajar. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Summoning all my courage, I pushed the door open. The room was pitch black, the only light spilling in from the hallway behind me. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Out of nowhere, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. I grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic set in, and I pounded on the door, yelling for help, but my voice only echoed back at me. Then I heard it again, the whisper. It was close, so close I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I slowly turned around, my eyes wide with fear. In the corner of the room, a shadow shifted. A figure stood there, watching me silently. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless and menacing. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the figure. The light revealed an old, dusty mannequin, its glassy eyes staring blankly. I let out a shaky laugh. It was just a mannequin, a cruel joke someone had set up. I walked over to the door, trying to calm my racing heart. As I reached for the doorknob, the whisper came again. This time it was unmistakable. "Get out!" The voice whispered, low and cold. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The mannequin hadn't moved, but the voice was so close. It felt like someone was right next to me. I didn't wait to find out. I yanked the door open with a burst of strength I didn't know I had and bolted down the hallway. Grabbing my bag, I ran out of the building, not daring to look back. I burst into the cool night air, gasping for breath. I never worked late at that office again. I finished my project from home, and no deadline was worth the terror I had experienced. To this day, I still don't know what happened. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe it was something beyond explanation. But one thing's for sure, I will never forget that whisper telling me to get out.
Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you.
I was 12 years old the first time I stayed home alone at night. My parents were going to a dinner party and promised they'd be back by 10 o'clock. I was so excited. Finally, a night of true freedom. I could eat as much ice cream as I wanted and watch scary movies until I passed out. I thought it was going to be amazing. The evening started off just fine. I had my favorite flavor of chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream and was snuggled up in my favorite blanket. I picked a movie I had watched a dozen times before, but it still managed to scare me just the right amount. It was about a haunted house, and even though I knew every twist and turn, my heart still raced. Around 9 o'clock, I heard it for the first time, a soft, almost inaudible sound coming from upstairs. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. It sounded like someone walking around up there. I paused the movie and listened closely. The house was silent. Maybe it was just the old house settling, I told myself. My parents had said that so many times before. Trying to brush off the unease, I went back to my movie, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump. The wind outside howled, making the tree branches scratch against the windows like long, bony fingers. The sound was eerie, but I kept telling myself it was just the wind. Then, the noise came again, louder this time. It was coming from upstairs. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my phone and texted my mom. "Are you almost home?" I waited, but there was no reply. I checked the clock. It was only 9:15. They wouldn't be home for at least another 45 minutes. I decided I had to be brave. I stood up, clutching my blanket like a shield, and tiptoed toward the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, and I cringed at every sound. I reached the top of the stairs and listened. Silence. I took a deep breath and started checking each room. The first room I checked was my parents' bedroom. I slowly pushed the door open and peeked inside. It was dark, but everything seemed normal. Next, I checked my own room. Again, nothing out of the ordinary. I started to feel a little silly. Maybe it really was just the old house making noises. I was about to head back downstairs when I heard it again. This time, it came from the attic. The attic door was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down my spine. I'd always been scared of the attic. It was dark and full of old, creepy things my parents had collected over the years. I never went up there, but tonight, something felt different. I felt like I had to check it out. I slowly approached the attic door, my heart pounding harder than ever. I reached out and pushed the door open all the way. The stairs leading up to the attic were steep and narrow. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard the sound again, clear and unmistakable. It was a faint shuffling noise, like someone or something was moving around up there. I took a deep breath and started climbing the stairs. They creaked loudly with each step, and it felt like I was walking into a nightmare. When I reached the top, the attic was darker than I remembered. I fumbled for the light switch and finally managed to turn it on. The light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I looked around, my eyes sweeping the room. Old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs filled every corner. Everything looked the same as it always had. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something unusual. One of the old trunks was slightly open. I was sure it had always been closed before. I walked over to the trunk, my hands shaking. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were just old clothes and a few books. I let out a sigh of relief. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. This time it was right behind me. I spun around, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing there in the shadows was a figure. It was tall and cloaked in darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I slowly backed away, my mind racing. What was it? How had it gotten into my house? I took another step back, and the figure moved closer. I could hear my heartbeat, loud and frantic. Then, the figure spoke in a low, cold voice. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This is my home now." I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I flew down the attic stairs, almost tripping in my haste. I sprinted down the hall and the main staircase. I grabbed my phone and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was standing in the middle of the street. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial my parents. When they finally picked up, I told them everything. They rushed home and called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the entire house, including the attic. They found nothing, no sign of the figure I had seen. They told my parents it was probably just my imagination, that maybe I had watched one too many scary movies. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never forget that night. I never felt safe in that house again, especially when I was alone, because I knew, somewhere in the shadows, that figure was still there, watching, waiting. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind where the wind howled like a ghost's wail and rain poured down in thick sheets, making the road ahead nearly impossible to see. I was sitting in the back seat of our old, reliable car, and my mom was driving. We were on our way home after visiting Grandma. The trip had been long, and I was exhausted. My eyelids felt heavy, and I could feel myself starting to drift off to sleep. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching stop, jolting me awake. I was thrown forward, my seatbelt digging into my chest. I looked up to see a man standing in the middle of the road. He was soaked from the rain, and his clothes were torn and dirty. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his eyes were visible. They were wild and terrified, like the eyes of an animal trapped with no escape. My mom gasped, quickly locking the car doors. She kept her foot pressed on the brake, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. We both stared at the man, unsure of what to do. He looked desperate, but there was something about him that made me uneasy. My heart pounded in my chest, and a feeling of dread crawled up my spine. Before we could react, 3 more men appeared from the shadows. They seemed to materialize out of nowhere, like ghosts in the darkness. They surrounded the car, banging on the windows and pulling at the door handles. My mom screamed, and I could see the panic in her eyes. "Lock the doors," she shouted. "Keep them locked." I fumbled to obey, my hands trembling as I secured my door lock. I was so scared that I could hardly breathe. The men were yelling, but the rain and closed windows muffled their voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I knew it couldn't be good. One of them had a crowbar and started smashing it against the driver's side window. The glass held, but small cracks began to spread across it. My mom's eyes widened with fear, and I realized that we were running out of time. "Hold on tight," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm getting us out of here." She floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward. The man with the crowbar barely jumped back in time, just missing the car. The others scattered, shouting angrily as we sped away on the rain-slicked road. The car skidded and swerved, but my mom kept it under control. She drove as fast as she could, her eyes fixed straight ahead. I turned around to see the men shrinking in the distance. My heart was still pounding, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. "Are you okay?" my mom asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was too terrified. My mom reached back and grabbed my hand, her grip firm yet still trembling. "We're safe now," she said. "It's okay. We're safe." We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds being the rain pounding on the roof and the engine humming. My mind was racing with questions. Who were those men? What did they want? Why were they trying to get into our car? As we got closer to our neighborhood, the rain started to let up, and the storm began to pass. The sky was still dark, but I could see the faint glow of streetlights ahead. I began to relax slightly, the tension in my body slowly fading. When we finally pulled into our driveway, my mom parked the car and turned off the engine. She exhaled a deep breath and looked at me. "Always lock your doors," she said. "No matter where you are or how safe you think it is, always lock your doors." I nodded again, fully understanding her warning. That night had been a terrifying reminder of how quickly things could take a turn for the worse. It was a lesson we would never forget. As we stepped into the house, my mom put her arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. The warmth and safety of home felt like a thick blanket wrapping around us. We were home and we were safe. That was all that mattered. We didn't talk much about what had happened that night, but the memory stayed with us. It was a sobering reminder to always be careful, to always be aware of our surroundings, and to always lock the doors. It was a hard-earned lesson, but one that would keep us safe in the future. I arrived at a rundown motel on What Avenue in Sacramento late one evening, exhausted after a long day on the road. The motel looked just as shabby and worn out as the online reviews had warned, but it was cheap and I was too tired to care. I checked in, got my room key, and dragged my heavy suitcase to room number 12, hoping to get a few hours of rest. The room was worse than I had imagined. The wallpaper was peeling off the walls, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. The bed, with its sagging mattress and thin, worn-out sheets, didn't look inviting at all. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, hearing the springs creak beneath me. As I sat there, I felt an itch on my arm. I scratched it, but then I felt another itch on my leg. Looking closely, I saw tiny reddish-brown bugs crawling on the bedspread. Bed bugs. Just my luck. There was no way I could sleep on that bed now. I glanced around the room for another option and spotted the small, grimy bathroom. The bathtub, though not exactly clean, seemed like a better alternative than the bug-infested bed. I grabbed a spare blanket from my suitcase and laid it out in the tub. The hard surface was uncomfortable, but at least I wouldn't get bitten by bugs. I lay down in the bathtub, pulling my jacket over me for warmth. The hard surface made it difficult to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won, and I drifted into a restless slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. First, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the main room. My heart started pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a stray animal. But then I heard a louder noise, like someone bumping into a piece of furniture. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was in my room. I quietly reached for my small pocket knife, the only weapon I had. My hands shook as I unfolded the blade, gripping it tightly. I slowly climbed out of the bathtub, careful not to make a sound, and crept toward the door, peeking through the small crack. In the dim glow from the streetlight outside, I saw a shadow rifling through my suitcase. My blood ran cold. An intruder was rummaging through my belongings. I had to do something, but I was terrified. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure froze and turned to face me. It was a tall, gaunt man with scruffy facial hair and wild eyes. He looked just as startled as I was. We stood there, staring at each other, neither of us moving. Finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice shaky. "I thought this room was empty." I tightened my grip on the knife. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was just looking for a place to sleep. I saw the window was unlocked and figured I could crash here for the night. I didn't know anyone was staying." My mind raced. He didn't seem dangerous, but I couldn't be sure. "You need to leave now," I said firmly, trying to hide my fear. The man nodded slowly. Okay, I'm going," he said. "I didn't take anything, I swear." He took a step toward the door but paused, looking back at me. "You should lock your window. It's not safe around here." I watched him carefully as he slipped out the door and disappeared into the night. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My heart was still pounding, but I felt a small sense of relief. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, trying to calm myself. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous situation, but thankfully, it hadn't turned violent. Looking around the dingy room, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I quickly packed up my things, double-checking to make sure I hadn't left anything behind. The itch on my arm reminded me of the bed bugs, and I shuddered at the thought. As I left the motel, I made sure to lock the car door securely. The sky was beginning to lighten, signaling the first hints of dawn, and I decided to drive to a nearby diner. I needed a strong cup of coffee and some time to gather my thoughts. Sitting in the diner, surrounded by the early morning chatter, I reflected on everything that had happened. It had been a terrifying experience, but I had made it through. The intruder's final words echoed in my mind. "This place isn't safe." One thing was certain, I would be much more careful about where I chose to stay from now on, and I would always lock the window. It was a cold and quiet evening when my family left for their trip. I waved goodbye, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. I'd have the whole house to myself for the weekend. I had plans to binge-watch my favorite TV shows and indulge in some junk food. At first, the idea of being alone didn't scare me, but as night fell, a strange feeling crept in. The house felt too quiet. Every creak of the old wood seemed louder and more unsettling. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was all in my head. I settled onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn and turned on the TV. The flickering light from the screen cast eerie shadows on the walls. After a while, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen, like a soft tap. I paused the TV and listened, but the sound had stopped. I shrugged, assuming it was just the house settling. Turning back to my show, I tried to lose myself in the story. But then, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Not just a tap, but a knock. My heart started to race. I got up and slowly made my way to the kitchen. Peeking around the corner, everything seemed normal. The doors and windows were all shut. I let out a sigh of relief and turned to go back to the living room. That's when I saw him. A man was standing outside the kitchen window, staring at me. His face was pale, and his eyes were wild and wide. He had a scruffy beard and wore dirty, tattered clothes. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak. He raised his hand and knocked on the window again, harder this time. Snapping out of my daze, I backed away, my mind racing. I had to do something. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. "What's your emergency?" the operator's calm voice asked. There's a man outside my window," I whispered, afraid he might hear me. "He's trying to get in." "Stay on the line," she said. "Help is on the way. Can you lock yourself in a room?" I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yes, I can." I ran upstairs and locked myself in my bedroom. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, trying to stay calm. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The operator kept talking, reassuring me that the police were on their way. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. He had broken the window. He was inside the house. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. I could hear his footsteps on the stairs, coming closer. "He's in the house," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Stay quiet and don't move," she replied. "The police are almost there." I heard him trying the doors one by one. When he got to my bedroom door, he started banging on it, trying to break it down. I pressed harder against the door, praying it would hold. Those minutes felt like an eternity. The banging grew louder and more desperate. Just when I thought the door would give way, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The man must have heard them too, because the banging suddenly stopped. Everything went silent. I strained to listen and heard the sound of running footsteps, then the front door slamming shut. He was trying to escape. A few moments later, I heard voices downstairs. The police had arrived. "It's okay. The police are here," the operator said. "You can open the door now." I slowly unlocked the door and stepped out. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. I made my way downstairs, where 2 officers were waiting. They looked at me with concern. "Are you all right?" one of them asked. I nodded, still in shock. "He broke in through the window," I said, my voice quivering. "We've got him," the other officer reassured me. "He's in custody now. You're safe." A wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was over. The officers stayed with me until my parents came home, making sure I was okay. I told them everything, and they assured me the man would be taken care of. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face at the window. But I was grateful that it was over and that I was safe. The police later informed us that the man was a drifter with a history of break-ins. He had been caught before but always managed to escape. This time, they promised he wouldn't get away. Since that night, I've made sure to double-check all the doors and windows before going to bed. I even had a security system installed. The experience shook me to my core, but it also taught me to be more cautious. When I was young, my parents bought a big old house in the middle of nowhere. They said it was an incredible bargain. We moved in, full of excitement for a fresh start. But little did we know the house had a dark history, a history that would change our lives forever. The house had a strange kind of beauty. Tall and imposing, it stood alone among whispering trees. It had wide windows and a sprawling porch, but there was something unsettling about it. The air around the house was always cold, even in the height of summer. At night, strange noises echoed throughout. Sometimes, when I was alone, I could hear whispers. I thought it was just my imagination. At first, my parents were happy. They worked tirelessly to make the house feel like home. Dad painted the walls in bright colors. Mom filled every room with flowers. They laughed and sang as they worked, but gradually the laughter faded. The house seemed to drain their joy. My parents started arguing over the smallest things. Dad's health began to deteriorate, though the doctors found nothing wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I got out of bed and saw my mom standing at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness. Her eyes were vacant, as if she were sleepwalking. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Then she turned and walked back to her room. The next morning, she had no memory of it. Things got worse. Dad grew weaker, always in pain and unable to work. Mom looked exhausted and sad. She had strange dreams and couldn't sleep. I wanted to help, but I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was happening. One evening, while rummaging around in the attic, I found an old book. It was covered in dust, with pages yellowed from age. The book told the story of the house. It had been built over 100 years ago by a man named Jonathan Crane. Jonathan was a wealthy but cruel man. He treated everyone horribly, even his own family. His wife, Mary, was found dead in the house, and rumors claimed he had cursed her. Since then, every family that lived there suffered tragedies. The house had seen fires, accidents, and unexplained deaths. I showed the book to my mom, but she didn't believe in curses. She said it was just an old story. She tried to burn the book, but it wouldn't catch fire. That night, the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut on their own, windows shattered, and the walls trembled. Felt like the house was angry. Dad died not long after that night. His death was sudden and unexplainable. The doctors were baffled. Mom was devastated. She couldn't recover, sinking into a deep depression. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, and eventually, she passed away too. I was left alone in that house, feeling the coldness engulf me. I moved out as soon as I could, but the house haunted my dreams. I kept thinking about its dark history and the families it had ruined. I knew it wasn't over. The curse would continue with the new owners. Years went by, and new people moved into the house. I hoped they'd be okay, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't be. The curse was too powerful. Tragedies kept happening. A young couple moved in, full of hope. They lost their child in a horrific accident. A single man moved in next, and he disappeared without a trace. I felt helpless. No matter how many attempts were made to cleanse the house, the cycle of suffering continued. Priests, shamans, and even modern paranormal investigators tried to break the curse, but nothing worked. The house remained a place of sorrow. Now, as an adult, I often drive past the old house. It still stands tall and proud, but I can see the sadness etched into its walls. I think of all the families who have suffered there, including mine. I think of the lives lost, the dreams shattered, and I feel a burning desire to end it. I want to destroy the house, burn it down, and end its legacy of pain. But I'm afraid. What if the curse is too strong? What if destroying the house only makes things worse? I don't know what to do. I see a new family moving in. They look happy and full of dreams. I pray they'll be safe, but deep down, I fear for them. I fear the house will take everything from them, just like it did to my parents and so many others. The cycle of misery seems unbreakable. But maybe, just maybe, there's a way to end it. I don't know how, but I have to try. I can't let the house continue to ruin lives. I owe it to my parents and to all the families who have suffered to find a way to break the curse. One day, I gather all my courage and drive to the house. I stand before it, feeling the cold, dark presence that surrounds it. I take a deep breath and walk up the steps. The door creaks open, and I step inside. The air is heavy, filled with sadness and rage. I hear the whispers and feel the house watching me. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I have to try. I have to end the curse once and for all. For my parents, for all the victims, and for the new family that now calls this house home. The house has taken so much, but it won't take any more. Not if I can stop it.